Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Shaharzad Akbar, the director of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission in Kabul, and Lisa Curtis, the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. I'm in New Delhi. I'm connecting the time zones between Kabul and Washington, D.C. And today we're talking about the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He's just been in India for the last 24 hours or so. Ladies, Ms. Curtis and Ms. Akbar, welcome to the Print Debates.
Thank you.
Ms. Curtis, I'd like to start with you. Mr. Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been in India, and on top of his agenda have been two issues: the Quad, of which India and the US are members, along with Australia and Japan and Afghanistan. Your first comments on why Mr. Blinken was in India, and I forgot to introduce you to my viewers. I should also say that in the Donald Trump administration, you were in charge of South Asia at the White House, at the National Security Council. So there's no one better than you to talk about what's happening with the Blinken visit in India.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. And, you know, it looks like Secretary Blinken's visit is going quite well. As you indicated, the top issues are the Quad in Afghanistan. And on the Quad, I think this is important timing. They're planning on holding another summit, perhaps at the end of September. So there is a lot to discuss in preparation for that next summit. But it was interesting that both sides made clear that the Quad is not a security alliance. And I think they did that to demonstrate to other countries, such as in Southeast Asia, which have been wary of having to choose between China and the Quad. So I think what Secretary Blinken and Minister Jaishankar are trying to do is quell any concerns that this is another, or that this is an Asian NATO, which is something that the Chinese have been putting out there almost to sort of denigrate the grouping. So they, emphasize that the Quad is focused on things like post-pandemic economic recovery, vaccine manufacture and distribution,
right,
climate change, all of these other softer issues. Now, the reality is that there may come a time for the Quad to have to show its military strength, and that is if China becomes assertive in the South China Sea, asserting its maritime claims, or on other issues. So there may come a time where the Quad does have to step up military, but for now, they seem to be focusing on these other issues. Now in Afghanistan, I think in contrast to seeing things the same way in the Indo-Pacific, the US and India have a slightly different view of Afghanistan.
So that was the question: why do the US and India? Okay, tell us a little bit about what the differences in approach are on Afghanistan between India and the US.
Well, I think the US has been talking with the Taliban for the last couple of years. Of course, India was sort of, late in doing this, although we have heard recently that they have started engagement with the Taliban. And I think that India is slightly more wary of, the Taliban ascending to power. Now, the U.S. seems to be sort of going back and forth. At times, the U.S. seems to be resigned to the fact that the Taliban would come back to power, seeing it as a fait accompli. At other times, and such as Secretary Blinken's statements in New Delhi, emphasizing that no, the Taliban cannot come back to power through the barrel of a gun. It must negotiate with the other Afghan players for a political settlement. So I think that this was an opportunity to more closely align their views, and hopefully India was able to, convince Secretary Blinken of the necessity to ensure that the Taliban are not able to ascend militarily.
Right. Shaharzad Akbar, may I bring you in here? I've been, if somebody reads your Twitter feed, there are some sort of very eloquent tweets that you have. One of them quoting UNAMA, which is the UN mission on Afghanistan. And one of your tweets says that women, boys, and girls made up nearly half of all civilian casualties in the first half of 2021 in Afghanistan. Almost 2,500 women and kids killed and injured, the latest UN report finds. Tell us what's going on.
First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be a part of this discussion. The UN, the latest UNAMA report and our findings also in the Commission are aligned, shows that May and June, in fact, have been having a record high number of civilian casualties. Unfortunately, the Afghan conflict already was very devastating for the civilians. Every year we had high numbers of civilian casualties as a result of the conflict and violation of international humanitarian law. It seems to have gotten worse this year, particularly the last 2 months, May and June. And the reason for this is, of course, Taliban are pushing for a military win. The key reason. And in pushing for a military win, they have not only caused, the conflict has not only caused civilian casualties. Of course, civilian casualties are not only attributable to Taliban, they are also attributable to government forces and pro-government forces, right, but mainly Taliban and anti-government forces, but also massive displacement and large-scale humanitarian crisis. And I think we will be soon. What's unfolding is also a human rights crisis.
Can I ask you, Ms. Akbar, are you angry? Are you upset? And are women like you upset that the Americans have cut and run and just exited overnight?
I am really angry about the way the withdrawal was done. Let me clarify that I am pro-withdrawal. I had never advocated for forever military engagement of the US and NATO. However, we heard a lot, especially from the Biden administration early on, about thinking around an Afghanistan policy and a responsible and orderly withdrawal. What we see on the ground does not indicate that this is a responsible and orderly withdrawal. I'm also, of course, very angry at Afghan political elite and political leadership, our president and the cabinet, because I think on our part as well, this was inevitable. We knew this was coming for a long time. Why weren't we better prepared? So I think many people that I talk to share these feelings. There is anger and this also sense of helplessness because the high levels of uncertainty, not knowing what the next few months or even weeks hold for majority of Afghans, particularly for women, because we have also seen advances of Taliban mean something different for women. Of course, they're imposing restrictions on everyone, men and women. But for women, they're basically trying to ban women from the public life, and it's much more extreme and it's much more felt and experienced more extensively.
So, Ms. Curtis, you were saying earlier that you hope that India's External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, would have persuaded the Secretary of State Blinken to come around to India, or come closer to India's views on Afghanistan. Now, what exactly did you mean by that? Are you bringing in the Pakistan factor, which has enormous influence in Afghanistan?
I think it's the, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, has eloquently stated how it's important, if the Taliban is coming into the governing systems in Afghanistan, it's very important how that happens. The international community should not allow the Taliban to just overrun the country militarily and then just accept their legitimacy as a fait accompli.
That's what the Americans are doing.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think that my hope is that Foreign Minister Jaishankar, behind closed doors, was able to make some progress in convincing Secretary Blinken of the necessity of not allowing the Taliban to just overrun the country, recognizing the Taliban has not changed, that they continue to have links with Al-Qaeda. We know this, the UN put out a report in June talking about how Al-Qaeda was still present, particularly in Taliban-held areas, that the Taliban had told Al-Qaeda before they signed the Doha Agreement not to worry, that they would remain allies. So we simply have seen no signs that the Taliban has broken its links with terrorists. So that's one problem. The second problem is the Taliban have been targeting civilians. They've been assassinating, human rights workers, women activist leaders. And they, of course, have been pushing for military gains throughout the country. So they've shown no interest in a negotiated settlement. So, if the U.S. had hoped to bring some kind of negotiated settlement with the Taliban, the signs are not pushing in the right direction. So I think it's time for the U.S. to put its support behind the Afghans we have been supporting for the last 20 years.
Right.
And and there's also another piece of this equation, and that is that President Ghani needs to be willing to work with other power brokers. If there's any hope of saving the country, I think they have to find a way to work with other power brokers in the country to stand up to the Taliban advances.
Right. We'll talk about that and how the Afghan elite is so divided, whether it's President Ghani or Dr. Abdullah or former President Hamid Karzai, Marshal Dostum, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But Ms. Curtis, the point is, the Joe Biden administration has been in power only for the last 6 months. You were very much part of the Donald Trump administration. Zalmay Khalilzad remains the special envoy for Afghanistan across both administrations. The Americans knew exactly what was happening. So why is it that, of course, you've lost lives, you've lost money. This is not your war. You need to get out after 20 years. But why is it that it's so shabby, this exit? What is it that you could have done better?
Listen, I did serve in the Trump administration, but I will be clear now that I think the Doha Agreement is a very weak agreement. And it was not negotiated in a manner that really was looking after the interests of Afghanistan. It's more of a withdrawal agreement for the U.S. It's not a peace agreement. It doesn't bind the Taliban to negotiating a political settlement. It also demanded that the Afghan government release 5,000 hardened Taliban prisoners without the Taliban having to make any concessions. So let me just be clear about that. Okay. But the Biden administration had an opportunity. When they came to power in January, they could have reevaluated the Doha Agreement. They could have, revamped the strategy to Afghanistan. There was nothing saying that, their hands were tied. They had to adhere to the Doha Agreement. But I think the problem was that President Biden came in very sour on the Afghanistan conflict, wanted to get U.S. forces out, and so saw the Doha Agreement as a way for him to be able to fulfill what he had wanted to do anyway, which was withdraw. So he went against U.S. military best advice to keep a limited presence there. So that's unfortunately where we are.
Right. Ms. Akbar, can I ask you now, both the Donald Trump administration as well as the Joe Biden administration, as Lisa Curtis is saying, were desperate to get out of Afghanistan, right? Now, do you feel that the Americans have thrown you to the wolves? And do you also feel that the Americans have, in a sense, let Pakistan expand its influence in Afghanistan?
Well, initially, when the Biden administration came into power, there was a lot of talk of Afghanistan policy. We were very unhappy with the U.S. Taliban deal signed under President Trump. It was clear that there was nothing in there for protection of Afghans. Basically, even the understanding around the reduction of violence was an understanding that was not implemented. It wasn't a commitment made explicitly in writing, at least in the green parts of the agreement that we saw. So we were very, very unhappy with that. And in multiple discussions with Ambassador Khalilzad, me and other human rights activists raised the issues around civilian protection, around the fact that Taliban have changed their tactic. They are now killing human rights defenders. This is one of the most important gains of Afghanistan, resource of Afghanistan. And we are letting this happen, How can we let this happen? But then the expectation with the Biden administration, I think, wasn't necessarily a prolonged presence, but how do you manage this withdrawal? And I think when there was a lot of talk of Afghanistan policy, I thought there would be something somewhat coherent, understanding that Biden didn't have a lot of great choices, but something somewhat more coherent than just safe withdrawal. I was just recently in DC, and I was very disheartened to hear that the focus, mainly everyone that I was talking to in the US administration, was mainly on safe withdrawal of troops and SIVs.
Yeah, I mean, they need to get out. You can understand why.
Of course, absolutely. I think there's no argument about that. But I think people spend so much time arguing about to get out or not to get out, that there wasn't a lot of thinking perhaps about how to get out.
Right.
And linking it to September 11th and, doing it completely unconditionally and setting no new conditions that would be relevant to the peace process, and even sucking energy out of the peace process just before the withdrawal was announced. If you remember, on the same day that there was an announcement made about the Istanbul meeting that was supposed to revive the peace process, on the same day there was the withdrawal announcement. The timing of this, could they not do this at least better? And so Istanbul was dead, of course, and subsequently the peace process was dead. And here we are now, where now the logic is the battlefield logic. There is no investment on the peace table. And this means more and more losses for Afghans, for civilians.
Yeah. So Ms. Curtis, the Chinese have invited Mullah Baradar, who's a key member of the Taliban negotiating team, key Taliban leader. They're in Beijing. They're talking to each other. The Taliban have promised the Chinese that they will not allow separatists to cross the border of Afghanistan. Now, the Chinese are it's well known that China and Pakistan have a very close patron-client relationship. So would you say that once the Americans exit, that China and Pakistan will have a much greater say in the future of Afghanistan?
Well, I think the problem is that China and Russia are going to look after Chinese and Russian interests, right? They're going to focus very narrowly on making sure that the Taliban go after the terrorists that they're worried about. I don't foresee that they are going to contribute substantially to a genuine peace process in the country.
What about Pakistan?
So Pakistan, remains a significant influence on the Taliban, but we have never seen Pakistan use that influence in a way that pushes the Taliban to make concessions for peace. And that's just a fact.
Why not? Why are the Pakistanis not doing that?
I think they don't want to break their relationship with the Taliban. For them, the most valuable strategic asset for them is the Taliban, because they believe that the Taliban will oppose India. They feel comfortable with the Taliban. They were comfortable with the Taliban when they were in power in the late 1990s. So despite the fact that the U.S. has repeatedly put pressure on Pakistan for its support to the Taliban, and even, Pakistan risked being placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list, Pakistan would not break those ties to the Taliban. And they have remained close to the Taliban. When we talk about Pakistan assisting with Taliban talks, really what they have done is they released Mullah Baradar from jail. Okay, so they released somebody that, we knew to be more pro-peace perhaps than other Taliban leaders. So they did do that. And then when the U.S. Taliban talks perhaps were getting shaky, they helped keep them on the rails. So they've been able to do small things in order to keep the talks, from imploding, the U.S. Taliban talks. But they haven't really done anything substantive to end the safe haven for the Taliban, or to get the Taliban to make concessions for peace. So I think we still have to see Pakistan's role is very unhelpful to bringing peace to Afghanistan. We have not really seen anything substantive from the Pakistanis to really show that they are going to support a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan.
So what does that mean? Does that mean to you that the Pakistanis want the Taliban in power in Kabul?
Well, they certainly are not opposed to them returning enough to do anything substantial. I think that's what we can say. And yes, there are probably elements within the ISI, within the Pakistan military establishment, that feel a little bit better about having the Taliban in power than, say, the Ghani government, who they would be fearful that, the Ghani government's going to be too close to India. So yeah, I don't think they mind having a Taliban return to power. And the unfortunate thing for Pakistan is that there will be blowback. Afghan Taliban ascendance in Afghanistan will also inspire the Pakistani Taliban, which attacks Pakistani interests. So unfortunately, by not cracking down the Afghan Taliban, they're not helping their own interests and their own stability in their own country. It's really a contradiction in Pakistan's policies.
Ms. Akbar, what do you say about this? Do you feel that the Americans have, by exiting so rapidly, by not talking about the future of Afghanistan and by involving the Afghan elite or the Afghan people, that in a sense they've allowed the Pakistanis to have a veto on your future?
I mean, certainly there is so much more that can be done on the regional dimension. I think one of the issues that I also raised with colleagues in DC was this: that the expectation from the Afghan side was that the US would really utilize its leverage more to get some concrete actions from the region, particularly Pakistan, because if the hope is that we will have some sort of political settlement that would, allow all sides to see themselves in an inclusive government, then we would need Pakistan to do much more in terms of, as Dr. Curtis was also saying, in terms of concrete steps. And we don't see that happening.
Why not? Why do you think that's not happening?
Well, I think many regional actors are just, hedging their bets, seeing what the military reality will look like. But I agree with Dr. Curtis. I don't think the Pakistani establishment minds seeing Taliban government in Kabul. And the Afghans feel very frustrated. Many Afghans feel very frustrated because they feel like this very core element of this war is not seen and is not reflected upon enough, and there's not enough engagement on it. All this talk even about civil war, of course there are Afghans fighting each other, but the regional dimension and the regional aspect is just, and this, especially in this particularly uncertain and difficult moment, it's just another cause, I think, for frustration.
Ms. Curtis, do you think that the Taliban, last week during the Eid prayers, we saw, for example, that the Taliban were firing at the presidential palace while the Eid prayers were on? President Ashraf Ghani, the NSA Hamdullah Mohib, former President Hamid Karzai. I mean, the Afghan elite were in that presidential palace grounds praying, and the Taliban were firing. So they are really close to Kabul. And how do you, what's been the reaction in DC?
Well, I think that was an enormous demonstration of strength and bravery that President Ghani and the rest of the Afghan leaders there continued on,
exactly.
Unflinching in their Eid prayers. And I guess it's just a reminder that, the Taliban do not appear interested in peace talks. Certainly, happy to see that they resume the peace talks in Doha. But frankly, given what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan, it seems that the Taliban is trying to appear like a legitimate actor, but it's really a smokescreen. So until we see actual indications that the Taliban is willing to talk about peace rather than pushing a military path to power, we shouldn't pretend like the Taliban is interested in a genuine peace process. So I think it's very disturbing to see what's happening in Afghanistan. They clearly made gains. The Taliban made gains in the north much more quickly than people expected. Mm-hmm. And there are concerns about what's going to happen in the south. Mm-hmm. But let me just point to a few things that the Biden administration is starting to do right. I agree completely with Shaharzad that this withdrawal process was mismanaged. There was clearly not enough planning going in, and it was done very quickly. But here we are. The U.S. is withdrawn. But now we are starting to see that the U.S. is continuing airstrikes from, over the horizon, from outside of Afghanistan, flying air missions to help the Afghan security forces.
Right.
We see that the U.S. is committed to the financial support for the Afghan security forces and the civilian assistance.
Sure.
We see that they're going to make sure that the Afghans can maintain their own air capabilities. This was a big mistake, withdrawing all of the contractors at the same time you're withdrawing US forces, big mistake. However, I think they're recognizing that now and they're trying to take steps to rectify the situation.
Right.
So again, I hope this visit, Secretary Blinken's visit to India, has helped, refine the U.S.
Do you think though that Secretary Blinken is going to come around to India's point of view, or to come around to the sort of the point of view that you are articulating right now, which is that the Taliban are a far more dangerous organization, and that despite the Zalmay Khalilzad agreement across administrations, that you cannot trust the Taliban. It's all very clear, isn't it?
Well, it seems to be becoming more and more clear with each passing day. So I don't see how the Biden administration cannot accept that the Taliban are not interested in a peace process until we see reduction in violence, ceasefire, a determination, at the table to find a negotiated settlement. Then I don't think we should be taking the Taliban at their word. We should be judging them by their actions on the ground in Afghanistan.
Ms. Akbar, I know you have to go, and you're also, you've got the generator on, which is the only way that you've been able to join the Zoom meeting and get electricity. I know you said that there's no electricity in Kabul, but just very quickly, one of your tweets, a very eloquent tweet from you, which was about the Taliban, and and I'm going to say this. It's you say that to eliminate women's public presence by terror, to repress, to attack human dignity and spirit, to attack diversity and difference, to attack art and culture, to rule by fear. This is what I remember from Taliban governance. This is what we see and hear now. How can they claim to change? So do you believe that the Taliban is going to be a repeat of what it was in the late 90s when it was in power for 5 years?
I think if we look at the evidence of what's happening on the ground now in many places, including my own district that fell to Taliban after 20 years, we don't see change. We see the same policies being implemented again. I mean, just an anecdote my mom was telling me this morning from our district, women are not allowed to go anywhere without a male companion. So this relative of us, her child was sick, and her husband is a daily worker, a daily laborer. So he had left very early, and she went to the hospital with her child and her 10-year-old son. And the Taliban were not, the Taliban soldiers there were not letting her into the hospital, and she had to argue her way in and cry and, plead because she didn't have a proper male guardian accompanying her. So what's changed about this? I don't know. I mean, what we see on the ground is that there are limitations on women's education. There are limitations on women's public participation. There are limitations on music, on culture. We heard from Kandahar, they killed, they took out and killed, reportedly killed a comedian. And this is, I don't know if what's happening in Doha is that they are putting on a show that is, that's a show for the world, but it's not the reality, or if they have no control or little control over what's happening in Afghanistan. Either way, it's very, very worrying. It's very, very concerning, particularly for women, for minorities, for the young generation of Afghanistan, for the Afghan media.
Is this already happening, Ms. Akbar, in the parts of Afghanistan they've taken? Is this already happening? Are the Taliban already implementing a very harsh spirit of Islam?
From what we hear from different parts of the country, yes, this is happening in many different parts of the country. The example that I gave you from my own district, it's happening in other places as well. Women, if they have to show up to work, mainly as doctors and nurses and as teachers. Not other areas of work, they are not open to women. Women have fled also, women prosecutors, women judges have fled areas under Taliban control. You see, as they advance, more and more people are fleeing into the cities, especially the people that feel targeted, people who feel nervous about being signaled out and being shot at, as what was happening in Spin Boldak, Kandahar. So I think if we have a negotiated, if we have negotiations, if we have talks, we have an opportunity to, in a peaceful environment, to discuss about what the future of Afghanistan can look like. And the majority of Afghans will have a say. It will hopefully be an inclusive process. But if it's a battleground, if they have guns in our civil society, our media, we have pens. This is the way we engage. It's through discussions. It's through dialogue. How is that equal? What's going to end up happening?
But isn't it a bit late for that, Ms. Akbar? I mean, the fact is that they are winning on the battleground, on the battlefield. I mean, we were talking about the Eid prayers last week when the Taliban were firing guns. So are you afraid about Kabul falling, for example?
Well, I'm nervous about the overall security situation. I don't have fears about in the near future about Kabul falling. I do that the terrorist attacks inside Kabul, Taliban's ability and IS and others' ability to organize attacks inside urban centers is unfortunately nothing new. This has happened in the past as well. But I think that the fact is that majority of Afghans, in terms of population, live in areas controlled by governments, and they prefer this system of governance, despite its corruption and a lot of flaws that it has. So I think it's important if there's an opportunity for meaningful peace talks, those voices will come out and those arguments will have to be made. But I don't know if we have that anymore. I don't know if we can revive the peace process. That's the uncertainty that's hanging over our heads and is creating anxiety.
Ms. Curtis, you have the last word. How do you think, the Americans are leaving and the Afghans are going to be left to fend for themselves?
Well, I think the best chance for avoiding a rapid Taliban military victory is for the United States to sustain its robust financial support, the Afghan security forces, to sustain its air support to the Afghan security forces, and to make clear to the Taliban that if you keep pushing for a military path to power, you will not be accepted internationally. You will not be given legitimacy. You will receive no financial assistance from the international community. I think we need to make that clear in order to push the Taliban into a genuine peace process, rather than having this sort of pretend talks in Doha, while meanwhile we have violence raging in Afghanistan.
So one last question to the two of you. What can India do, Ms. Akbar?
I think our expectation from regional countries, especially India, who has had a long-standing relationship, of course, with Afghanistan in terms of also humanitarian and development assistance to Afghanistan, as well as cultural relationships, is to play a constructive role in reviving the peace talks. I don't see a military solution to Afghanistan's problem. Afghan people have suffered for a long time.
India is not even part of the peace talks. How can India do that?
Well, India does not, or the region as a whole, but India does not have to be part of the peace talks directly. But I think if the message goes out clear from everyone in the region that their preferred solution to the Afghan conflict is a solution sought through negotiations, not violence, and that this is reaffirmed. I think what makes us Afghans nervous is this hedging that we see, this hedging behavior that we see from regional countries as at this moment of uncertainty. I think there needs to be very clear and consistent messaging that regardless of the battleground reality right now, we don't want military takeover of Taliban. That's not something that can be supported by anyone in the region. It will have consequences.
And Ms. Curtis, what do you think India can do or should do?
I think India has two major roles. One is it has a good relationship with President Ghani. It can push him to work with the other power brokers, to listen to other advisors. We keep hearing that he is sort of cloistered in the palace and only listening to a handful of advisors. He needs to create a bigger tent, bring in other anti-Taliban Afghan leaders, and they need to come together. I mean, if ever there's a time to try to unify the Afghan political elite, this is the time to do it. So India can help on that front. India can also play a larger role on the regional stage. I think we're starting to see that. Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been traveling, meeting with different leaders in Russia, Central Asia. So I think India does need to assert that role, because India has a valuable voice in that it does support a democratic, peaceful Afghanistan It does understand the challenges from terrorism. And so we need India's voice at the table and, asserting its rightful regional place in these peace talks.
Well, we hope that Ashraf Ghani is listening, and certainly that the Taliban are listening, and that the people of Afghanistan are not going to allow the repressions that the Taliban unleashed the last time they were in power. Dr. Lisa Curtis, Shaharzad Akbar, thank you so much both for your time and for participating in the print debates. Thank you again.